Oh, goody.
Alright, what's going on everybody? Zombies here again. Welcome back to another episode of Snap History, where we take a trip back to the past and relive the early days of Marvel Snap. Before we dive into the Savage Lands, I just wanted to give a huge thanks to everyone who checked out the first episode of this series about Silver Surfer. The response was overwhelmingly positive, and it really helps drive my passion for continuing the series. If you haven't seen the first episode yet, I'll have a link to it in the description below, and I highly suggest checking it out to have a better understanding of where things were at going into Zabu's release. And if you enjoy this series, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. It helps out a ton. With that out of the way, let's look back to the prehistoric era of the Savage Lands. On January 2nd, 2023, Zabu released, and with him came a new hope of combating the oppressive reign of Silver Surfer. Unlike Surfer before him though, this was a past card whose broken potential was immediately apparent. We had seen how Surfer completely changed the game for 3-cost cards the month prior, and now it looked like Zabu was positioned to do that exact same thing for 4-cost cards. At release, Zabu is a 3-2, with ongoing, your 4-cost cards cost 2 less, but not less than 1. Cheating mana has always been incredibly powerful in pretty much every card game ever made, and Marvel Snap is no different. Sarah was commonly viewed as one of the strongest Series 3 cards in the game since launch, and her energy reduction ability was a core part of what enabled Silver Surfer decks to consistently play multiple 3-drops. The same was also true for Mr. Negative, who dominated the game in beta at his original 4-4 stat line, and, much like Sarah, was a core enabler of the other most successful Silver Surfer deck, due to powerful energy cheating. Given there really were not too many other options for energy cheat out there, it's no surprise Zabu immediately joined his peers at the top of the metagame. Unlike Surfer before him though, the variety of Zabu decks was significantly more distinct and varied. While there was some overlap between them running generically strong 4-cost cards, the deck's strategies each had a pretty unique playstyle that made them stand out from one another. There was a commonality between them though, and it is often remembered as one of the most toxic and hated combos ever seen in Marvel Snap, and it all stemmed from one friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. As I briefly alluded to in the Silver Surfer saga, Absorbing Man wasn't the most sought after Series 4 card at his release, and a big part of that was due to his 4 energy cost, making it awkward to weave in other powerful cards alongside him. Now with Zabu in the picture, that immediately changed. It turns out when you can play a strong on-reveal card for half its normal cost, and then use Absban to double up on it on the same turn, broken things can happen. The most broken and despised of these combos used Old Spider-Man to essentially lock opponents out of being able to play into 2 of the 3 lanes going into the final turn of the game. Spider-Man was a 4-3 back then. With on reveal, your opponents can't play cards here next turn. While there were still some ways of accessing the closed down lane, such as moving cards like Vision or Nightcrawler, or summoning tokens like Doombots or Tigers, none of those cards were really strong enough to be viable versus the meta tyrants defining the format. This notorious combo was a key part of what pushed out other non-Surfer top decks from still finding some success in this meta, like they did previously in December. Shuri She-Hulk and Barrow Deathwave both relied on big turn 6 power plays that the Absorbing Spidey combo effectively shut down rather well. As such, it was an incredibly rough time for anyone lacking these 2 most recent Season Pass cards, because they simply were competing on another level compared to just about everything else in the game. In terms of decks that utilize Zabu effectively, there were a plethora of different options to choose from. The most popular version that most people probably remember was the one that focused around Lady Sif and Ghost Rider discarding big threats to resurrect like the Infinite and Giganto, while still packing control elements like Shang-Chi or Enchantress, as well as the Absorbing Man Spidey combo for board control. Jubilee was also quite powerful here, serving as an alternate way to cheat out your big boys, dig for Zabu, or just get some additional value off Absman if Spidey wasn't around. Since this deck had Absman as its only non-pass card above Series 3, it was considered a more budget-friendly option, and was generally more attainable by the player base compared to some other versions. On the other end of the spectrum, we had Zabu Darkhawk, a deck very few players played in its prime due to the scarcity of Series 5 cards, and much of the player base passing on Darkhawk upon his initial release 1 month earlier. Due to less players having the card, refinement of the archetype was much slower than what you would see today. But in general, one of the stronger homes for it involved doubling up on as many Hawks as possible with cards like Moon Girl and Mystique. The deck was so focused on being all in on Zabu that many didn't even run Korg, instead using just Rock Slide with the aid of Absman or Wong for additional rocks to pump up the Hawk. As someone who did have access to those cards at the time, I can safely say spamming out 3 or even more Darkhawks in a game is one of the most broken things I can remember from the early days of Marvel Snap. With Zabu being a powerful 3-cost card, naturally he was also experimented with in Surfer decks too. These versions were more varied in terms of card inclusions, but the main draw here was using things like Wong and Absman to accumulate even more buffs from Silver Surfer. While the deck was still making use of the best 2 cards in the game at the time, it did feel like it never truly reached the same heights as the more focused versions of Surfer and Zabu respectively. That said, even being a slightly worse version of those decks was still significantly stronger than the vast majority of other decks in the game. One last deck that won over favorability from the community for Zabu was that he was still useful for brand new players with a budget Devil Dino list, unlike Surfer, who was more limited by the strong 3-drops in Series 3. Dino decks have been the go-to for new players since the start, and Zabu's ongoing cost reduction provided a significant boost to cards that the deck already wanted to play, like Moon Girl, White Queen, and Shang-Chi. As such, the card had a bit more of a positive overall reception since more players could get use out of it. Surfer decks remained popular and powerful too, but for this reason, Zabu was seen significantly more by the average player. In terms of the other cards that released that month, it is possibly one of the most underwhelming months of release in Snap's history. The strongest card of the bunch, Sauron, didn't have a true home yet in Shuri decks, because original Shuri did not require playing into her lane to gain the power doubling effect. Because of this, Shuri decks strongly relied on defensive ongoing cards like Cosmo and Armor to protect their big threats from Shang-Chi, so the trade-off of removing Red Skull's ongoing simply wasn't worth it in the current versions of the build. The rest of the new cards were all 4-drops, very clearly balanced around the mana cheating enabled by Zabu. Shadow King was a 4-3, Shauna was a 4-2, and Dazzler was a 4-4, who got a +6 power boost if you're able to fill up all 3 locations. Unfortunately, these cards just paled in comparison to many of the 4-drops players already had access to in Series 3 and below. So with that, combined with the fact that new Series 5 cards were still rare and expensive, it was incredibly uncommon to see these cards be played in this season. It also added a major feels bad element, where if a player was lucky enough to hit that 0.25% odds for a Series 5 card from a cache, they could get something that was super useless instead of a card that enabled a cool new deck like Thanos, Galactus, Shuri, or Bast. But at least they get a cool first edition badge for it later down the line, right? Much like Surfer before it, Zabu was a card that there really wasn't a great counter for. The main option available was Enchantress, but with her coming down on turn 4 without the aid of Zabu's boost, he could already get value in playing 2 4-drops before she was able to come down and silence his effect. It's actually kind of crazy looking at these cards in Snap today, where Dazzler and Shadow King have essentially had their Zabu reduction baked into their regular cost, and Shauna has received a very significant buff to a 3-4. Despite nerf discussions being a hot topic going into the Savage Land season, the community's cries for help seem to fall on deaf ears, with no immediate word on upcoming balance adjustments. Then, when the first wave of changes was brought on January 10th, it was anything but what people were hoping for. Arrow, Leader, Galactus, and Nova all lost 1 point of power, while 1 point of power buffs were granted to Drax, Groot, Hazmat, Black Cat, and Nakia. The outrage was swift and fierce, as not only did these +1 and -1 adjustments seem unimpactful, they also ignored the season pass-sized elephants in the room of Zabu and Surfer. In hindsight, it's a bit easier to understand that this patch was likely locked in well before Surfer and Zabu got out of control, but the delay between locking patches in and their release timing was something the community was largely unaware of at the time. On a more positive note though, shortly after the patch, we got the very first news about series drops, which were Snap's plans to help combat their expensive card release model. While new cards would always release in Series 5, they would drop down in series over time, eventually making their way to Series 3, where they were essentially free. This was generally met with much praise from the player base, even with a handful of cards being labeled as permanent Series 5 big bads. Ultimately though, this release model would not be sustainable long term, as it resulted in only a very small section of the player base engaging with new releases consistently outside of the season pass, while most players were content to wait it out for series drops to avoid paying the high initial asking price for new cards. In retrospect, this system was generally bad for almost everyone. Second Dinner was making less money off new releases because too few people were willing to pony up the cash for their new cards. Metagames were generally more stagnant because after finishing Series 3, acquiring new cards slowed down to a crawl, with players getting essentially enough tokens for one card a month, while Series 3 incomplete players had no hope of engaging with them at all. And content creators who tried to showcase new releases were often met with either hostility or indifference because their experience was so far removed from the general player base who had no hope of engaging with these new cards on a regular basis. The real winners here were people who didn't mind having a more stagnant metagame and were also happy to wait and obtain cards for a discount or even free by waiting long enough. But those players seemed unlikely to provide the game with the needed financial support to keep it going long term. Eventually, something about card acquisition would have to change, and Second Dinner even referenced that in one of their patch updates during this month. But that's a story for another time. The remaining 3 weeks of the season went largely unchanged, aside from the fact that Zabu decks were being further refined with more playtime. Eventually, the game seemed to turn into Zabu Snap at higher ranks, where you just snap as soon as you knew you had Zabu, ready to come down on turn 3, and if your opponent didn't have their own Zabu or a good Surfer curve, they would often just leave. This made climbing the ranks especially brutal, and back then it took even longer to get to Infinite, with each rank requiring 10 cubes to go up instead of 8. It was a truly miserable experience, and it's why you see many veteran players talk about their Zabu PTSD to this very day. As the month neared its end, there was a new glimmer of hope on the horizon. A patch hit on January 31st, and with it came one of the harshest nerfs to everyone's least favorite big brain, Leader. Leader was an incredibly busted card back at the start of Snap, giving you copies of all your opponent's cards played that turn as his on-reveal effect. While he was clearly overtuned and often hated by players, I don't think anyone really expected him to get essentially deleted from the game. Leader was changed to a 6/7 on reveal. Copy all cards your opponent played to the location to the right, but on your side. In general, this was a change met with much praise, as players absolutely hated losing to their own cards, which was surely a lesson Second Dinner would remember in the future, right? Wolverine was also changed here, going from a 2/3 that when discarded or destroyed gets played to a random location, to a 2/2 that grants +2 and regenerates to a random location when discarded or destroyed. This patch also added Battle Mode as a way to play versus friends, and for the first time enabled community-run tournaments. While both the card changes and Battle Mode were well received, players were still unhappy about no news on the Surfer and Zabu front. It felt more and more like these cards were being ignored because people paid money for them via the season pass. Community uproar about these cards was at an all-time high, and so Second Dinner finally released a statement about them. Zabu and Surfer started dominating the game after the previous patch had already been locked in. But fortunately, due to some new over-the-air patching technology, nerfs would be coming for them sometime next week. Things were finally starting to look up for Marvel Snap, with hope that the game could soon return to its relatively well-balanced state like it was on release. On February 8th, 2023, Silver Surfer and Zabu were finally nerfed. And with these nerfs, we got a whole blog post dedicated to breaking down why these changes were being made, as well as the general balance philosophy behind Snap. It was even directly addressed that they were a bit hesitant to adjust these cards because of the potential damage to consumer confidence it could have, so it was not something to be done lightly. It also mentioned that the goal wasn't to delete these cards, but rather to bring them more in line so other strategies could still find success. This comment in particular felt like an almost direct response to the claims from the community that Leader had been effectively deleted just 1 week earlier. Zabu was changed to a 2/2, with ongoing, your 4-cost cards cost 1 less, and Silver Surfer became a 3/2 that buffed your other 3-cost cards with +2 power. It was also revealed that in spite of Zabu's popularity and perceived dominance, Sarah Surfer was actually the #1 champion of the season, with a positive win rate against 75% of the field. These nerfs were significant, but many players were hopeful it would result in the cards still being playable without entirely warping the meta around them. Not everyone was pleased with these changes though, as there were still many players who simply disagreed that the 2 Season Pass cards were overpowered in their original forms. At the very end of the blog, it was also mentioned that for future balance changes, generally they weren't going to be using this over-the-air method, as there were still some flaws to it, but they were going to experiment with smaller but more frequent balance changes in the future to see if it delivered a better experience for players. And as we can see in the modern era, now most balance changes are done purely via OTA, and that has fixed a lot of problems, whereas full patches made it a bit too difficult to accurately respond to developing metagames in a timely manner. Would these changes be enough, though, to bring balance and prosperity back to Marvel Snap? We'll find out next time, when we shrink down to the Quantum Realm. If you enjoyed this video, and were around for this time in Snap, let me know what you thought about it in the comments below. If you want to see more content like this, be sure to like and subscribe. It helps out a ton. Thanks for watching.